Give me some breathing room. Let's clear the air. I got to get this thing off my chest. I got the wind knocked out of me. Or I got winded. Give me a second to catch my breath. Our culture has all these sayings about breathing, and breathing is probably one of the most fundamental movements that you can do because you're doing it all the time. And your cardiopulmonary system is literally working all the time, and you never stop that cyclical process of delivering oxygen to substrate and scrubbing CO2 and removing waste products. And people just think respiration is about breathing, and they don't realize things like the contraction of your respiratory muscles massage blood through your internal organs. They basically help circulate your visceral organs. And the biggest lymph organ, which is your spleen, and your largest lymph node sit right on top of the diaphragm. So all your breathing impacts circulation. If you think the heart is the only pump in the body, you're wrong. The heart, the lungs, and even the muscles work in unison as a pump. You'll live 3 weeks without food, about 3 days without water, and probably about 3 minutes without air. So if you're someone who's trying to up your fitness game without focusing on your breathing, I would say don't hold your breath. Hey, it's Ben Wise, and this is The Fitness Movement. The Fitness Movement is brought to you by Zor Fitness. Zor Fitness is my company and my platform to deliver incredible training-related content to people just like you. I don't just podcast. I write in-depth fitness articles. I break down common movements in the sport of fitness. I program workout plans, and I offer one-on-one coaching for competitive and recreational athletes. And the best part is most of what I have on zorfitness.com is totally free. Check out these resources by going to zorfitness.com. That's ZOAR fitness.com. Hope to see you there. And welcome back to my rant on holding your breath. So today's outline, I'm going to go through 4 different points. First of all, why would someone actually hold their breath? So why enter into any sort of apnea protocol? Number 2 is scenarios where you're actually going to be holding your breath in fitness. So in the sport of fitness, how it's currently tested, where and how are we holding our breath? And is that a good thing? Is that a bad thing? Let's break that down. And then 3, we're going to transition into managing those apnea scenarios in workouts specifically. So just staying specific to the sport, what is that going to look like when we're managing those breath hold scenarios in a workout? And then 4 is being poised during suffocation, which is basically maximizing your fitness potential through those apnea protocols. And then we'll go through 3 different layers of least complex to most complex. And for each of those, I'll be including examples. So where I want to start this conversation off, it's just think about holding your breath in general. So in general, if someone did that, whether it's intentional or not, that's called apnea because someone is stopping breathing. That's the idea. So if someone has sleep apnea, they're stopping breathing while they're sleeping. And any sort of apnea medically is a really bad thing. Just like if someone is connected to like a pulse ox that's measuring their peripheral oxygen saturation and that drops or CO2 would rise, that would be considered to be like a quote bad thing. So in a scenario like that, we should give that person supplemental oxygen, right? Like that makes sense. Well, maybe for a short-term fix, that would be a good thing. But for a long-term improvement and adaptation, that's actually definitely not what you would want to do. If we give someone more oxygen chronically over a long period of time, then their body doesn't need as much in order to actually be efficient and the problem will get worse. And I'd actually rather give that person supplemental CO2 because it could be dosed in a form like movement, like for example, walking. And if we expose that person to CO2 more frequently and chronically, then they'll adapt and become more oxygen efficient over the long term. And this is the whole concept of exercise. Like we expose ourselves to a stimulus with the hope that you adapt in a way that you actually get better suited to handle whatever that stimulus actually is. If you're constantly doing things that require endurance, then you're going to become more enduring. And in the case of breathing, if you're constantly are doing things that challenge your breath, then you become more efficient for everything that you do while breathing, which is everything. So by managing your breath, you literally become better at everything. So let's take this to scenarios where you're going to be holding your breath. So apnea scenarios in fitness. So first of all, this is going to be anytime we have rotational or linear midline forces. So when you have to be really rigid and express high stability. So really this is just to protect your spine. That's like the mechanism for that. So an example of this, I remember this winter I was walking down a flight of stairs and I didn't realize that they were icy and my foot slipped on one of the stairs and I almost fell. And when I did that, I actually caught myself and I never actually fell, but I went and I held my breath, and you kind of gasp and hold your breath like that. And that's what you do in a survival setting where it's a mechanism, it's a reflex where you're onboarding oxygen and you're protecting your central nervous system. So you're protecting your spine because you don't want your spine to get injured. So you create tension through your core to protect your spine and your nervous system. And that's why you're creating that tension. And this actually takes effect in a couple different ways in fitness. So for one, we could be bracing during heavy lifts. So say like you catch a clean, you're going to make sure that you're really stiff and you can brace and you're upright and you're creating a lot of intra-abdominal and intrathoracic pressure. And that brace is preventing you from rounding, which is not only efficient for moving bigger loads, but it's also effective in terms of you actually being able to prioritize your central nervous system protection. 2 is bracing to generate strong rotational forces. So if you think about if you're going like a max effort sprint, so say you're doing like a 40-meter dash fully rested, you're going to occlude your breathing. So you're going to stop breathing for a period of time so that you can create and control all the rotational forces that are going on there. Or if you're doing that tri-directional power on the assault bike where you're doing a max effort sprint, you have to pull with one hand, you have to push with the other hand, and you're creating this big rotational force. And in order to do that the most effectively that you can, you have to hold your breath while you're doing that. It's the same thing with swinging a sledgehammer. So if you're doing a max effort sledgehammer swing, you're going to have to hold your breath to generate as much tension as you possibly can while doing that. The third point here is just bracing to maintain a high supported position during a pivot point. So as you go to change directions, that's what I mean by pivot point, is when you're just going to occlude your breath for just a second, you're a quick breath hold, quick apnea, and that's when you're going to change directions in that movement. So for example, say you're doing a back squat. If you're doing a max effort back squat, you're going to hold your breath basically by the time you unrack the bar and set yourself to the time that you go down the hole all the way back up, then you'll exhale after you've gone past a sticky point in your squat. At that point, you're okay to breathe again. If it's a relatively light load, you're not going to hold your breath the entire time because that's not efficient for the sport. If we're doing 50 air squats, you're not going to be bracing maximally each time you do that. This is really poor management of tension there. So the goal is to create just enough tension at that pivot point where you can be stiff and rigid and maintain your high support position, but also be efficient. So say you're doing a back squat with 95 pounds and your max is over 300. So you're just going to hold your breath for just a fraction of a second as you change directions in the bottom of the squat, and then you're just going to breathe normally again. It's the same thing for a deadlift. If you're doing moderate touch and go deadlifts where you can probably get 20 or 30 unbroken, you're not going to be holding your breath the entire time through that range and only breathing when you're locked out. That's what you do with a max load. At a submaximal load, you're only going to breathe above your knee. So as you descend in your deadlift, you're going to hold your breath for just a portion of a second, and then as it gets past your knee again, you're going to breathe out again. So you'll kind of hear this. Obviously, I'm exaggerating, but that's the idea, is that you occlude your breath for just a portion of a second, and that's really a small little chunk of apnea. You're stopping breathing in a moment. It's the same thing if you're dipping and driving the jerk. If you want to be as rigid as possible and the most transfer of power into the bar and be super aggressive and rigid like you have to be and stiff, then you're going to have to hold your breath during that time. If it's a clean and jerk at 30% of your max, you don't need to brace like that. But if you're at 70, 80, 90% of your 1 rep max, then you're going to have to reset, get a big breath, hold it, and then drive overhead. It's the same thing with the arch in the muscle up. It's the same thing with the actual touch of like a touch and go snatch, right? Where you're going down towards the ground, pause for just a second, holding that breath, occluding, and then right back at it again. It's the same thing with a clean. It's the same thing with the deadlift. I can go through all these different examples. And for each of those, there's going to be a very brief breath hold at a certain loading, and below a certain loading, you might not need to. So if say it's a 65-pound snatch and you're a very strong male, you're probably not going to have to brace very much at all while you're moving through that. But if it cuts to a certain threshold, say it's above 95 pounds or above 30% of your 1 rep max, in that range is when you're going to have to start occluding your breath and holding that breath for just a period of time. So those are probably the most common apnea scenarios that I see in workouts. Let's talk now about managing those apnea scenarios. So while you're actually holding your breath, what can you do to mitigate that the best that you can? Because obviously that's not an ideal scenario. Ideally, you'd be breathing freely at all times. However, that's not the reality. The reality is that you're working against the tension that you're creating as well as the tension of the actual bar that you're lifting or the implement that you're lifting. So there's a couple of things that I think would be a good goal to improve. I have 3 different things here that I think are going to help you manage those apnea scenarios, those breath holds in your workouts. So number one, I think one of the biggest goals, and I think this is probably the one that people would think of first, is improving your strength. So if you have to occlude your breath at, let's just say it's 35% of your 1 rep max. So anything above 35%, you're going to have to stop breathing for just a period of time. Well, then if you get stronger and you bump up your maxes, then that threshold moves up as well. So now you're occluding at a higher weight, and the workout loads that are predetermined, just set weights. So like maybe 95 or 65 pounds, that's going to feel relatively lighter, and you're not going to have to hold your breath as much when you're going through those reps. So I think people largely understand that, and that's one of the reasons why people want to get stronger for the sport of fitness. But it's more complicated than that, and it's more nuanced than that. So for one, this means that you don't have to recruit as many motor units. So in other words, you don't need to harness as much muscle mass to get the job done. If you're stronger, prescribed weights are going to feel lighter because they're literally at lower percentages of your 1 rep max. So again, you don't have to brace as hard. So if we take an example of this, let's say your deadlift max is 315 pounds as a male or 205 pounds as a female. If you're doing rounds of DT, which is just a really simple workout with a barbell that involves deadlifts, those deadlifts at 155 or 105, that prescribed weight for that workout will be 50% of your 1 rep max. So it's going to require a breath hold because at that range, basically everyone's going to have to occlude their breath for a short period of time. If those athletes can increase their maxes to say 455 and 305 for males and females, and then that DT workout weight now is about 35% of your 1 rep max. So the brace that you need is actually very minimal, or the brace that you should need. I'm not going to say that's always going to improve that way, but typically that means that brace is not going to need to be as much, and that you don't have to hold your breath basically at any point during the movement. So you can breathe much more freely at a deadlift around 30% of your max than around 50% or more of your max. And like I said, there's more to it than that, but I think that general understanding is helpful to just start to process in that. So number one was improving your strength. Number two is improving your aerobic power. So this means at the same pace, aka the movement density, you will accumulate less fatigue. So as you go through a workout, if you have less fatigue accumulated, then when the demands of the workout require you to hold your breath for just say a fraction of a second, then it's going to be more sustainable and you won't feel like you need to stop and rest to catch your breath. So if you are more aerobically developed and at the same place, you're going to be accumulating less fatigue and you're going to have less of a demand and a reason to have to stop and rest. And just typically, this is what people are thinking about, like improving their engine, but this is a side part of that. Like, yes, you're improving your engine, but you're also improving your battery. The idea that you can repeat a heavy load again and again, which is something where you're going to have to occlude your breath for. You're going to be better suited for that because you're actually more aerobically powerful and more aerobically developed. And then number three is improving your composure during suffocation. So I think this is especially important for people who have not had a lot of experience doing CrossFit tests. So maximal exercise, that's really challenging. And I think a lot of people who have performance anxiety around maximal exercise in general, not even necessarily saying they're at a competition, but say you give them a tester and they get really anxious for it because they know it's going to hurt really bad. This can actually help them quite a bit, just maintaining their composure during suffocation. That idea is that you can hold your head underwater, as a metaphor, longer. So the idea that you can be in the pain cave for a longer period of time and that you are as okay with that as possible. It never gets easy, but you learn to manage it in a better way. So here's the deal. Regardless of how strong you are and how high your lactate threshold is, you are eventually and inevitably going to get to the point when you end up where you did before. In other words, if you're stronger and fitter, that means that you can just go harder and faster and you end up in the same place that you did before. So like you're in the pain cave. So this means regardless of how strong and fit you are, you need to get better at dealing with that feeling of suffocation that you get when you're at maximal exercise. So I think this is a very underrated skill, especially for competitors, because testing workouts feels a lot like holding your breath. Like, let's be honest, it feels like you're suffocating. So being poised during suffocation is a very useful skill. A little asterisk here. There's definitely a difference between suffering and adapting. So just because you're going hard in a workout does not mean that your fitness is going to improve. There's plenty of athletes that I know that are really good at suffering that aren't super fit. And actually vice versa. I know people that have pretty high fitness levels who aren't super great at suffering. And my last little asterisk here is that it is possible to get too good at apnea protocols, where it's the same thing as like getting too strong for CrossFit. Like I don't bring that stuff up much because most of my listeners aren't dealing with that, but it is possible to get too tolerant of CO2. It is possible to get too good at learning how to deal with suffocation, where you're blocking some of the natural signals from your body to get you to breathe more effectively. But for the most people that are dealing with this podcast and listening, they're not too strong for CrossFit. They're not too great at apnea protocols where they're actually going to get hurt from that. Unless you're a very high level athlete or highly trained in one of these specific areas, this isn't going to be an issue for you. So unless you can clean and jerk, I'm just using that as a comparison here, but unless you can clean and jerk 400 pounds or 300 pounds as a male or a female, you're not too strong for the sport. Unless you can hold your breath for 5 or 7 minutes, you're not too well adapted in apnea to get results from that. So just a little, again, I'll just call it an asterisk there, like a little thing to keep in the back of your mind, but I don't think it applies to most people. But before someone calls me out on it, I do want to put it in there. So let's go back to being poised during suffocation. So the goal here is twofold. One is maximizing your fitness potential through these apnea protocols. And then 2 is controlling your perception of you not actually being able to breathe. So in other words, being okay or composed while you're not able to breathe. So you're not breathing. You know what? I'm okay with that. Most people are not okay with that. We need to get more exposed to it so that we are okay. Just like being okay holding a very hard pace in a workout is a very rare skill. So I'm going to go over some of the means and methods, and I'm going to put examples to them, but the examples are just ideas. There's nothing special about them. Just like when I give workout examples on here, there's nothing special about a workout unless it's in a comprehensive program that makes sense. So really, these are just to spark your ideas. That's the purpose of those. One big disclaimer that I want to give here is do not hold your breath while you're doing anything that you could hurt yourself or someone else. So don't be holding your breath while you're driving. Don't be holding your breath if you're pregnant or in a pool or holding a child, or again, literally anything where you could be, if you passed out, that you would hurt yourself or somebody else. Don't do it. Like I myself have passed out doing breath work, like in my living room, blacked out on the floor. I've almost blacked out doing apnea protocols in pools. And that was even when there's a lifeguard on duty, but it was still scary because you don't know if someone's watching or not. So if you're doing anything like that, you need to be very diligent about it. Like your living room floor is probably the safest place that you can do this. So here's the thing. When I blacked out and I was laying in my living room, I was like, it's all good. I wasn't worried about it. Like, well, I wasn't consciously thinking about that, but like after the fact, that's what I thought. Like, hey, it's fine because I was already laying on the ground. There was nothing wrong. Like I passed out and just started breathing. Like that's how the mechanism is supposed to work. But when I got close to blacking out in the pool, that's a very scary moment. So let me just say this, don't be dumb. It's not worth the risk. So now that I've excited some of the masochists out there, let's get into it. So there's 3 layers, low to high arousal. So I'm building arousal through each of these. So arousal is basically being the level of excitement. So things that are low arousal are going to be very controlled environments. Things that are high arousal, think of like a gym and working out at a gym with loud music playing and other people being there and super intense, or competition. All those would be high arousal situations. So we're going to start with low arousal because that's the easiest place where you can actually control your state and be able to control as many factors as possible and stay calm, because it's going to be very hard to stay calm when you're holding your breath. So this is kind of for first layers, low arousal environments where you're seated. You could be supine, prone. Ideally, you should just be silent in these scenarios. So example 1, layer 1, example 1. Every 4 minutes for 4 sets, it's going to be a breath hold to RPE 7. So when you get to the point where it's 70% of what you think a max hold would be, that's where you're just going to stop and start breathing normally again. So just a quick note, a breath hold is anytime I'm inhaling and pausing. A breath pause is anytime I'm exhaling and pausing. So this is a hold on the inhale. So every 4 minutes times 4 sets, up to about 70% or RPE 7. And one of the things that you'll see, I did this about a month ago, and you'll see some interset adaptation. What I mean by that is over the course of those sets, your body's going to adapt to get you better at being able to hold your breath. So when I did this, I had my first one was a 148. So I held my breath for 1 minute and 48 seconds. And that was about 70% of what I thought I could do. The next one, I held it for 210. The next one was 233. And the next one was 3 minutes. So my last set was almost double that of my first set. And all of them were RPE 7 or about that. So you will see some of that interset adaptation, and that's a good thing. You want to see that. Our next example would be 5 sets, resting 2 minutes between a breath pause to RPE 7, directly into a breath hold until RPE 9. So if I just explain this and talk us through it, you're going to pause on that exhale. You don't have to breathe entirely out, just like most of the way out. Hold until RPE 7, directly inhale, so no extra breaths. You take the air in, and then you hold on the inhale until an RPE of 9. So say you do 30 or 40 seconds on your breath pause, would be actually probably pretty good score for that. And then immediately into your breath hold, and say you do that for another 20 or 30 seconds. You'll rest 2 minutes, and then you're going to repeat that for 5 total sets. The last example I have in layer 1 here would be a cadence 2 protocol. So I'm just going to give you 2 different examples. It's really about the ratio. So it's a 1-1-2-1. So an inhale is going to be, just say it's 1 second, and hold is going to be 1 second. The exhale is going to be 2 seconds. The pause is going to be 1 second. So just say you're doing a breath every 30 seconds and you did that for 5 minutes. It would be inhale for 6 seconds, hold for 6 seconds, exhale for 12 seconds, pause on the exhale for 6 seconds. So it'd be every 30 seconds, you're doing 1 breath. So for a beginner, that is going to be quite challenging. They might only be able to do that for 2 or 3 minutes at a shot and then have to rest and repeat. For a more advanced person, they're going to be able to get probably up to like an EMOM for this, where it's like 12, 12, 24, 12. So they're taking 1 breath every minute on the minute with that really long exhale and that pause, which gets super intense. And they could probably do that for easily over 10 minutes, or maybe not easily, but they could definitely sustain it. So those would all be examples of layer 1. I'm not saying they're all easy because they're not by any means. I'm saying they're all low arousal. So those would be just seated, lying in a very controlled environment, probably just like silent in your living room or bedroom, a very controlled environment. Layer 2 is going to be any sort of moderate arousal environment. So let's call this different types of environments where we might be walking or standing or very easy aerobic work. You'll get the idea once I go through the examples. So the first example, walking your dog. You're going to be nasal breathing while you're walking your dog. On the minute, you're going to be doing a 15-second breath hold. So nasal breathing the entire time on the top of the minute. So at 200, at 300, you're just going to hold your breath for 15 seconds. Another example would be a breath hold to high effort in each of the following positions, resting 1.5 minutes between. So positions are the bottom of an air squat, hanging from a pull-up bar, just a dead hang, a plank hold, and a good morning hold with an empty barbell. You're going to go through that for 2 rounds. So for each of those, you're going to a breath hold to high fatigue or high effort in each of those positions, and then resting 1.5 minutes between. So say you held your breath for 1 minute in the bottom of the air squat, rest 1.5 minutes, breathe easy. Then you'll go to hanging from the pull-up bar. Say you do that for 1 minute, 15 seconds. You'll again rest for 1.5 minutes. You'll move on to the plank hold. You'll go to the good morning, and then you'll repeat that whole cycle 1 more time. And then my last example for layer 2 here is 5 rounds of a max effort breath pause. So again, that's on the exhale, directly into, so no rest, into a 1K row at your 5K time trial place, plus 5 to 8 seconds. So that's a very easy pace. So my 5K pace is a 151 per 500 meters. So that'll land me just under 2 minutes per 500 meters for my 500 meter split. After that 1K row, I'm going to rest for 1 minute, breathing nice and easy, and then I'm going to repeat that for 5 total rounds. So again, going through that max effort breath pause directly into the 1K row at the 5K time trial place, plus 5 to 8 seconds, and then breathing easy. And what this is teaching you to do is, while oxygen is fairly low and while CO2 is fairly high, you have to be able to immediately start producing power on an erg. And then you have to be able to recover while you're actually rowing at that pace. And that should be recovery pace. And then you get a very short rest and you repeat that. So that's the quality that we're going to be driving up during this time. And then layer 3. So this is going to be relatively high arousal environments. I'll consider high arousal to be exercise. So these are all going to be exercise related examples. So the first one is actually from 1440 Athletics, which I used to go to that gym. I'm friends with a lot of the coaches there. The workout is an 800 meter run 4 times. But here's the catch, is that you can only run while holding your breath. And each time you have to stop to breathe, you do 5 burpees. So you get to breathe while you're doing the burpees. You do not get to breathe while you're running. And then you continue that until you run 800 meters. So my next example is the Zor Fitness CO2 tolerance test, which is a 1.5 mile assault bike where you can only touch the pedals and actually produce power while you're holding your breath. So you can only breathe while you're not actually powering the bike. So I posted that on our Instagram a while back. My time was 4:47 on that. If anyone can beat me, tag Zor Fitness, tag ben.wise, and I will send you a free shirt. So again, that was a 1.5 mile assault bike, but you can only touch the pedals while you're holding your breath. If you give it a go, even if you don't beat me, tag us. I'm just always curious to see where people are at that. So that is our CO2 tolerance test, but it's basically an apnea protocol. So the next one is EMOM 15, 3 back squats at 82%. So basically this is just strength work, right? And in the strength work, by demands of the movement itself, because you have to brace and create inter-abdominal pressure, you're going to have to hold your breath while you're going through these back squats. So by nature, it's an apnea protocol. And by nature, it's very high arousal because you have to be very stiff and rigid to be able to move a back squat effectively. So in order to get through that full 15 minutes, you're not just going to have to be able to hold your breath for a period of time. You're also going to have to be able to create a lot of power and tension and stiffness, but you're also going to have a great aerobic system to be able to recover in between those bouts. And then my last example here is every 2 minutes for 5 sets, you're going to be doing max double unders during a breath hold. So you take a nice big breath in, and then you just do as many double unders as you can until you fail or you have to breathe. Then you stop and you actually go to single unders. During your rest is when you're doing continuous single unders, but it's every 2 minutes during that time where you take a big breath, hold it, do as many double unders as you can, and then as you have to breathe, go back to single unders. So obviously you have to be able to do those protocols effectively. So this is more so for intermediate and advanced athletes, but doing these probably 1 to 2 times per week for a season of time is going to greatly improve your ability to maintain your composure during various types of fatigue and metabolic pain. So think about like when the workout gets really intense and your body starts throbbing, for lack of a better word, you're going to have better composure. You're going to be able to stay relaxed in those scenarios. And I know everybody says, don't hold your breath, but I'm going to sound like Oscar from The Office here, but actually, it sounds like you should hold your breath. Hey, it's Ben again, and I wanted to take a minute to talk about our online training program, The Protocol. The Protocol is for athletes who want to train for the sport of fitness. It's programmed by me, and it's my best attempt at preparing athletes with varying strengths and weaknesses for the demands of the sport. And I do this through the use of silos, which basically means I segment parts of the program based upon athletes' ability in a particular area. So for example, an element of the program this fall on Tuesdays and Thursdays was gymnastics-focused training. And there were 4 different silos, so athletes could choose to work on chest bars or muscle-ups or handstand push-ups or handstand walks. In other words, we are all doing the same core program, but there are ways to individualize it on a weekly basis. And as part of the program, I also include coaches' notes, technique videos, and educational resources almost daily. My goal is to not just have this feel like you're doing a workout plan, but to feel like I'm actually coaching you through the process of becoming the best athlete you could be. And having access to the protocol is just part of the benefit of being a pro member. You also get instant access to the Vault, which is exactly like it sounds. It means that you unlock the ability to be able to download all the programs that I've ever written. So this includes things like Bulletproof Body, which is the accessory work for functional fitness, gymnastics density for the Big 5, functional thickness, your first muscle up, cyclical supremacy, overhead squat mobility, breathwork for the sport of fitness, and it could go on and on. And lastly, you get instant access to pro articles, which are on topics that I really want to safeguard from the public and keep for my athletes. Stuff like cycle speeds for CrossFit open movements, strength ratio data analysis, so basically determining your relative weaknesses on strength work, breaking down sanctionals programming or games programming, energy systems testing and analysis, and a whole lot more. And if this sounds like stuff that you're into, you can get a 7-day free trial of Pro. Simply head over to zorfitness.com/pro. Thanks for listening, and as always, stay the course.